Deputy FBI Director Dan Bongino placed a heavy, three-ring binder on the desk. He didn't come to debate, he came to prosecute. Let me tell you something, Madam Secretary. Dan Bongino leaned forward in his chair, his Queen's accent sharpening like a knife being drawn. I spent 12 years protecting people like you. Secret Service, Presidential Protection Division. You know what I learned? The people who need the most protection are usually the ones who deserve it the least. Hillary Clinton's practiced smile flickered just for a second. But Bongino caught it. He'd spent years reading faces, watching for tells, spotting the micro-expressions that separated truth from lies. That flicker told him everything he needed to know. She was already rattled, and he hadn't even started yet. The CNN town hall had been her idea. Accountability in law enforcement was the theme, and Hillary had positioned herself as the expert on Justice Department oversight. The voice of reason calling for reforms. She'd spent the past hour lecturing the friendly audience about the dangers of politicizing law enforcement, about the need for independent institutions, about protecting democracy from authoritarians. And then Anderson Cooper had introduced Deputy FBI Director Dan Bongino. Hillary's entire demeanor had changed. The condescending smile had appeared, the one she reserved for people she considered beneath her. Former podcast host, conservative media personality, street cop from Queens playing dress-up in a position he wasn't qualified for. She'd interrupted before Cooper could even finish his first question to Bongino. Anderson, I think we need to acknowledge the elephant in the room. That laugh, the one that made half of America cringe. Mr. Bongino. Excuse me, Deputy Director. Bongino spent years on his podcast pushing dangerous conspiracy theories about the FBI. About me. About our intelligence agencies. The audience applauded. They were her people. Carefully selected Democrats who had come to cheer her on, to give her the adulation she craved to help rebuild her image for whatever political comeback she was planning. He's unqualified for the position he holds. Hillary continued, her voice dripping with that Ivy League condescension she'd perfected over decades. A political hack who's dangerous to have in law enforcement. He protected presidents apparently, but clearly learned nothing about how government actually works. The applause that followed was a manufactured thunder. A wall of sound designed to isolate the outsider and reinforce the hierarchy of the room. Anderson Cooper shifted his weight in the sleek, modernist chair, his posture betraying a deep, unsettling uncertainty about the trajectory of the evening. The script had been written in invisible ink long before the cameras went live. The elder stateswoman would undress the upstart pretender. The audience would provide the laugh track, and the news cycle would spend the next 24 hours celebrating her triumphant return to the arena. But the air in the studio felt heavy, charged with a static electricity that prickled the skin. Bongino sat immovable amidst the jeers and the orchestrated adulation. His eyes locked on the woman sitting across the plexiglass divide. He was not taking the bait. He was not reacting with the explosive temper they had clipped and mocked from his podcast days. Instead, he was channeling a different version of himself. A ghost from a past life where emotion was a liability and observation was the only currency that mattered. He watched her bask in the validation of the room, noting the slight tilt of her chin, the way her eyes scanned the crowd for approval rather than meeting his gaze. It was a performance, masterfully executed, but a performance nonetheless. She was attacking his resume, his history, his very right to breathe the rarefied air of the studio, painting him as a dangerous anomaly in the machinery of state. She characterized him as a conspiracy theorist, a partisan wrecking ball swinging wildly at the pillars of democracy, a man who had protected power without understanding its nuance. The insults were polished, rehearsed, and delivered with the confident cadence of someone who had never truly feared consequences. Bongino let the silence stretch after she finished, a tactical pause that sucked the oxygen out of the room. The audience's applause died down. replaced by a confused murmur as they waited for the shouting match that did not come. He set his pen down on the table. The sound was small, a sharp click against the glass. But in the sudden quiet, it sounded like the racking of a slide. He spoke then, his voice dropping to a register that forced the audience to lean in, asking with deadly calm if the secretary had finished her opening statement. He stated that he had been waiting a very long time for this specific conversation. Not as a podcast host, but as a man who knew where the bodies were buried. Hillary's smirk widened, a reflex of arrogance. She believed she had already won, that her pedigree and her command of the language had sufficiently cowed him into submission. She saw a man she could dismiss. He saw a target he had been tracking for a decade. With a slow, deliberate movement that commanded the attention of every camera lens in the room, Bongino reached down beside his chair. The sound of a heavy object being lifted broke the stillness. He hoisted a thick, 3-ring binder onto the desk. It was not a prop. It was the ugly, bureaucratic artifact of a federal investigation. Its spine cracked from use. Its pages tabbed with color-coded markers that jutted out like warning flags. The atmosphere in the studio shifted instantly. The mockery evaporated, replaced by a primal tension. This was the visual language of the courtroom, the aesthetic of prosecution. Bongino began to dismantle her premise. His Brooklyn accent bleeding through the professional veneer not as a sign of unrefined anger, but as a marker of authenticity. He addressed the accusation of conspiracy theories directly, defining the term as wild accusations made without evidence. He contrasted that with what he was about to do, which was to present facts, documents, her own correspondence, and immutable evidence. He opened the binder. The heavy thud of the cover hitting the table echoed like a gavel strike. He directed her attention to the reality of his position as deputy FBI director. He reminded her, and the millions watching at home, that unlike the pundits and the spin doctors, he had access to the files. He emphasized the physical reality of those files, the boxes of raw data, the unredacted truth that lay dormant in the archives of the Bureau. He noted, with a cutting dryness, that unlike some people in Washington, he actually took the time to read them. The audience had fallen dead silent. Anderson Cooper leaned forward, his producer's voice likely screaming in his earpiece. But he was frozen by the sudden pivot from political theater to legal peril. Bongino circled back to her mockery of his time in the Secret Service. He acknowledged the truth of it, validating his past to weaponize it against her. He had held a top-secret PSY clearance. He spelled out the acronym, letting the weight of the words sensitive compartmented information hang in the air. He explained to the layman in the audience, and the experts in the press, that this was the highest classification level in the United States government. A level of trust that granted access to the darkest corners of national security. He posed a hypothetical scenario, asking the room to consider what would have happened to a Secret Service agent, a man of his former rank, if he had treated such information with the cavalier disregard she had shown. He didn't wait for an answer, he provided the verdict. He would be in a federal supermax. He listed the consequences with the rhythm of a sentencing hearing: loss of clearance, loss of pension, loss of freedom, the complete and total destruction of his life. He asserted that this is exactly what should happen to anyone who mishandles the nation's secrets, regardless of their last name or their political ambitions. With a flick of his hand, he turned to the first tabbed section of the binder. The paper rustled loudly in the quiet studio. He announced that it was time to discuss her emails, turning her own attack on his qualifications back onto her record of conduct. Hillary's face had lost its flush of victory. She attempted to interject, to spin the narrative before it could solidify. But Bongino steamrolled her attempts with the momentum of a freight train. He was no longer debating, he was reading into the record. He held up a document for the cameras. The text dense and official. He cited the FBI case file summary regarding the Clinton email investigation. He read the numbers into the record. 33,842 emails sent or received through a private, unsecured server while she served as the nation's chief diplomat. He emphasized that hundreds of these contained classified information. He pulled another page, reading directly from the text. Citing a specific date in June of 2011, he identified the document as marked Top Secret Special Access Program. He explained the significance of the SAP designation, his voice rising in volume, the controlled fury beginning to leak through the cracks of his composure. He told the audience that this was intelligence so sensitive that even individuals with standard top-secret clearance were barred from seeing it without specific mission-critical authorization. He described the contents of that email: drone strike operations, the identities of deep-cover intelligence assets, the operational details of shadow wars being fought in the dark. He demanded to know the logic behind storing such volatile information on a server located in a basement in Chappaqua, New York, a server with less security than a standard Gmail account. He slapped the page down on the desk between them, a physical barrier of evidence. He moved to the next document. This one marked secret, no foreign. He translated the jargon for the public, explaining that no foreign nationals meant the information was strictly for American eyes. Yet it contained detailed conversations with foreign leaders and raw intelligence assessments of their governments. He painted a picture of reckless exposure, of state secrets sitting vulnerable to any foreign intelligence service with a decent hacker. Hillary tried to interrupt again, her voice shrill, claiming that the matter had been thoroughly litigated and that the FBI had found no criminality. It was the standard defense, the shield she had used for years. Bongino cut her off, his voice sharpening, his accent now unmistakable, raw and aggressive. He quoted Director Comey directly, throwing the Bureau's own words back in her face. He offered to read the entire statement, flipping to another tab with the muscle memory of a man who had memorized the prosecution file. He read the damning assessment, although the Bureau did not find clear evidence of intent to violate laws. They found evidence of extreme carelessness. He looked up from the page, locking eyes with her. He repeated the phrase, extremely careless, with a biting emphasis. He equated that carelessness with the potential for loss of life, stating that such negligence with top-secret information gets people killed. He threw his hands up in a gesture of mock confusion, asking the rhetorical question of what consequences she had faced. The answer was nothing. No prosecution, no charges, not even a reprimand. The silence in the studio was absolute. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the heavy, suffocating weight of cognitive dissonance crashing down on an audience that had been fed a diet of exoneration for years. Bongino was not offering opinions, he was reading the black and white text of the government's own findings. He was dismantling the narrative of competence and replacing it with a portrait of dangerous negligence. And he was just getting started. The binder was thick, and there were many, many more tabs to turn. The air conditioner hummed, a low drone beneath the tension, as Anderson Cooper watched the rails of his carefully planned town hall begin to buckle under the weight of the evidence. Bongino's eyes were cold, focused, and utterly without mercy. The podcast host was gone, the federal agent had returned, and he had brought the evidence locker with him. Bongino did not allow the silence to become a comfort. He let the reality of her impunity hang in the air for only a moment, just long enough for the injustice to register with the viewers, before he pivoted to the cover-up. The handling of the classified material was merely the predicate offense. The true weight of the scandal lay in what happened when the lights were turned on. He lowered his voice, dropping the volume to that dangerous, quiet register that made the hairs on the back of necks stand up. He began to narrate the timeline of destruction that followed the discovery of the server, framing it not as a series of clerical errors, but as a calculated obstruction of justice executed with forensic precision. He reminded the room of the timeline. After she had been caught. After the existence of the shadow server was revealed to the world. And crucially, after she had received a congressional subpoena, a legal order carrying the full weight of the United States government to preserve evidence, the deletion began. He reached into the binder again, bypassing the standard tabs and pulling out a technical analysis report. A document thick with digital forensics data. He cited the number that had become infamous, yet remained abstract to so many until this moment: 33,000 emails. They had simply vanished. Poof. Gone in the blink of a digital eye. With a harsh, grating laugh that lacked any mirth, Bongino addressed her public defense of these deletions. He recounted her claims that these 33,000 documents were purely personal in nature. Wedding plans for her daughter. Yoga routines. The mundane drift of a grandmother's life. He leaned back in his chair, spreading his hands wide to encompass the absurdity of the proposition. He challenged the very physics of her excuse, questioning whether she had performed 33,000 yoga poses in her entire life. A ripple of nervous laughter broke through the audience. Even those who had come to worship at her altar could not suppress the involuntary reaction to the sheer ridiculousness of the numbers. The logic didn't hold. The math didn't work. It was a lie so transparent it was insulting. Hillary's face flushed, a deep crimson rising from her neck. She opened her mouth to recite the standard talking points about her right to privacy, about the separation of work and personal life. But Bongino was already moving, cutting off her escape route before she could even take a step. He slammed the technical report onto the desk. He asserted that once a subpoena is issued, the right to curate one's own history evaporates. Deletion becomes destruction of evidence. Deletion becomes obstruction of justice. And these files were not simply dragged to the recycle bin. He began to lecture the room on the specific nature of the software used, adopting the tone of an expert witness explaining a murder weapon to a jury. He introduced the name, Bleach Bit. He explained that this was not the tool of a grandmother tidying up her inbox. It was not like emptying the trash on a desktop computer. It was professional-grade evidence destruction software. A digital acid bath designed to scour the magnetic platters of a hard drive until nothing, not a ghost of a file, not a fragment of code, remained. It overwrote the data multiple times with random zeros and ones. A process designed to defeat the forensic capabilities of the FBI and the NSA. He categorized the typical user base of such software: drug cartels, organized crime syndicates, mob bosses, people who had something to hide that would send them to prison for a very long time. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. He juxtaposed the image of a Secretary of State planning a wedding with the use of military-grade data wiping tools. The narrative she had constructed crumbled under the weight of that technical reality. Innocent people do not acid wash their servers. Innocent people do not use software designed to thwart federal investigators. Hillary attempted to interject, her voice tight with indignation, claiming she had every right to determine what was personal. Bongino shot back instantly, his voice rising, passion overcoming procedure. He declared that rights end where subpoenas begin. He pulled out another document. This one a list of names. It was a roll call of the damned. A list of individuals who had been crushed by the very machinery of justice that she now claimed to champion. He prepared to show the audience the difference between the ruling class and the ruled. He began to read the names, punctuating each one with a jab of his finger against the desk. A rhythmic indictment of the double standard. He started with Christian Saucier, a Navy sailor. He described Saucier's crime: taking 6 photographs inside a nuclear submarine. 6 pictures. Saucier was not selling secrets to the Russians. He was a young man making a stupid mistake. The consequence? A year in federal prison. A life ruined. A dishonorable discharge. He moved to Reality Winner, an NSA contractor. She had leaked exactly one classified document to the press, a document that arguably served the public interest regarding election interference. Her sentence? 63 months in federal prison. Over 5 years of her life erased for a single document. He continued with Brian Nishimura, a naval reservist who had downloaded classified materials to his personal devices for convenience. Much like the secretary claimed to have done, he didn't intend to sell them. He didn't give them to foreign powers. But he broke the rules. The result? 2 years of probation, a $50,000 fine, the loss of his security clearance, and the permanent stain of a criminal record. Bongino's voice grew louder, trembling with a righteous anger that resonated in the cavernous studio. He emphasized that these were real people. They were not political abstractions or talking points. They were fathers, daughters, soldiers, patriots. Their lives were destroyed for doing a fraction, a microscopic fraction, of what she had done. They had processed a handful of documents, she had processed thousands. They had made mistakes, she had set up an illicit infrastructure. He stared directly at her, stripping away the titles and the pomp, addressing the human being beneath the pantsuit. He told her exactly what the difference was between her and them. It wasn't the law. It wasn't the intent. It was the bank account. It was the connections. It was the last name. They were regular Americans who made mistakes and paid the price. She was a Clinton. She was part of a protected class that viewed the law as a spider web, strong enough to catch the weak, but fragile enough for the powerful to tear right through. He let the accusation hang there. He summarized the indictment. She had established a private server system to circumvent the Federal Records Act, conducted all her State Department business on it to avoid oversight, sent and received top-secret information for 4 years. And then, when the law came knocking, she destroyed the evidence under subpoena. And yet, she sat there, on national television, lecturing him about accountability. Anderson Cooper, sensing the total collapse of the town hall's structure, finally found his voice. He asked Secretary Clinton if she would like to respond. His voice was tentative, the voice of a man watching a car crash in slow motion. Hillary's hands were trembling. Bongino noticed the vibration in her fingers as she gripped the armrest. He had rattled her to her core. She fell back on the only defense she had left, the accusation of partisanship. She called it a witch hunt, a political hit job designed to smear her record. Bongino cracked the whip of his response before she could finish the sentence. He reminded her that he was reading from the FBI director's own statement. He was reading from federal court documents. He was reading her own emails. These were not partisan attacks, they were empirical facts. They were the stubborn, inconvenient truths that refused to be spun. He flipped to a new section of the binder. The sound of the heavy pages turning was like the tolling of a bell. Hillary visibly flinched at the motion. She knew, and he knew, that the emails were just the gateway. The emails were the mechanism of concealment. But the audience needed to understand why the concealment was necessary. They needed to understand the motive. Bongino shifted his tone. He acknowledged that she was right about one thing. The emails were just the symptom. It was time to talk about the disease. He announced the next subject with a grim finality, the Clinton Foundation. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. This was the third rail of American politics. The complex, sprawling network of money and influence that had powered the Clinton machine for a decade. Everyone in the studio could feel the shift. The emails were technical, the foundation was criminal. Bongino began to pull out financial documents, spreading them across the desk like a royal flush. He cited the dates of her tenure as Secretary of State, 2009 to 2013. 4 years of absolute diplomatic power. He dropped the number into the silence, $2 billion. That was the amount the Clinton Foundation had taken in during her time in office. $2 billion. He let the magnitude of that figure sink in. He contrasted it with the reports from charity watchdog groups, citing the abysmal percentage of revenue that actually went to charitable work, less than 10%. The rest? Overhead, salaries, travel, awareness. Hillary tried to interrupt, desperate to stop the flow of numbers. But Bongino was in full prosecutor mode now. He was unstoppable. He invited the audience to look at who was donating. And more importantly, what happened to those donors after they wrote the checks? He pulled out a timeline chart, a graphic representation of the quid pro quo. He pointed to the first case study, Uranium-1. He laid out the pieces of the puzzle. The Russian nuclear agency wanting to buy 20% of America's uranium production. The requirement for State Department approval. The donation of $145 million from Russian interests to the Clinton Foundation. The $500,000 speaking fee paid to her husband, Bill Clinton, in Moscow. And then, the approval, the green light, the sale of American strategic assets to a geopolitical adversary. He looked up at her, his face a mask of Queen's cynicism. He told her that where he came from, above the candy store, they didn't call that a coincidence. They didn't call it diplomacy. They called it a bribe. The audience gasped. The word hung in the air, heavy and ugly. Bribe. Hillary's face went from red to purple, a vein pulsing in her temple. She sputtered her indignation, demanding how he dared to accuse her. She hid behind the bureaucracy, claiming she wasn't personally involved, that career officials made the decisions, that she was insulated from the process. Bongino cut her off with a voice dripping with sarcasm. He mocked the idea that the Secretary of State, the most hands-on, controlling politician of her generation, had no influence over a major policy decision involving nuclear assets. He presented the organizational chart. He showed her office, her authority. He gave her a binary choice, a trap from which there was no escape. Either she was lying about her involvement, or she was admitting to being so incompetent that she didn't know her own department was selling uranium to the Russians. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. He asked her to choose, corrupt or incompetent, because in the real world, it had to be one or the other. Hillary's mouth opened and closed, a fish out of water, struggling for oxygen, for a woman who had spent 40 years preparing answers for every conceivable question. She found herself rendered mute by the sheer, blunt force of the truth. Bongino pressed his advantage, sensing the kill. He wasn't done with the money trail. He was just getting started. And the next stop was Haiti. Bongino did not give her time to recover from the Uranium-1 revelation. The air in the studio had grown heavy, thick with the kind of tension that usually precedes a physical altercation. But here the violence was entirely forensic. He watched Hillary struggle to regain her composure, her eyes darting to the moderators, looking for a lifeline that wasn't coming. Anderson Cooper remained frozen, a spectator in his own arena, realizing that any attempt to intervene would be seen as protecting a suspect under interrogation. Bongino shifted the weight of his attack, moving from the cold, strategic betrayal of nuclear assets to a subject that carried a visceral, human cost. He announced that it was time to talk about Haiti. His voice took on an edge of genuine, simmering anger, the kind that separates a career bureaucrat from a man who has walked the streets and seen real suffering. He transported the room back to the 2010 earthquake, a catastrophe of biblical proportions that had leveled a nation and left hundreds of thousands dead under the rubble. He painted the scene not with statistics, but with the moral weight of the aftermath, the world weeping for the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. The billions of dollars in relief money that poured in from ordinary people, governments, and organizations, all hoping to help the helpless. He pulled more documents from the binder, the pages heavy with the tragedy of a failed state. He described how the Clinton Foundation had positioned itself at the center of this misery, acting as the self-appointed coordinator of relief efforts. But instead of schools and hospitals rising from the dust, Something else happened. He pointed to the specific case of Tony Rodham, Hillary's brother. He detailed how, amidst the chaos and the dying, her brother miraculously secured a lucrative gold mining contract in the devastated country. He laid out the pattern. Foundation projects received priority. Foundation donors received access, and the inner circle of the Clinton family received contracts. Bongino's voice rose, filling the studio with an accusation that was impossible to ignore. He noted that more than a decade later, Haitians were still living in tents, drinking contaminated water, while the promised infrastructure remained a mirage. The money had vanished into a labyrinth of overhead costs, consulting fees, and projects that never broke ground. But the foundation, he noted with a savage dryness, had done remarkably well. He read from the sworn testimony of Haitian activists, voices usually silenced by the global media machine. He recounted their words, describing how the Clinton machine had used their tragedy to raise capital, promising to build back better, but building nothing except their own dynastic wealth. He looked at her with undisguised contempt. This wasn't about mishandling paper anymore, this was about moral bankruptcy. He accused her of exploiting a natural disaster, of standing on the graves of earthquake victims to enrich her family and her organization. He labeled it not as public service, but as exploitation in its purest, most colonial form. Hillary attempted to fight back, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. She began to recite the phrase, discredited allegations, the mantra she had used to ward off scandals for 30 years. But Bongino was ready. He demanded to know who had discredited them. He answered his own question before she could breathe. It was her friends, her donors, and the media outlets she patronized. He refused to let the defense stand. With the precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor, he reached for a new tab in the binder. He pulled out a list that made the audience gasp, a ledger of foreign donations. He began to read the names of the benefactors, and the numbers were staggering. Saudi Arabia, $10 to $25 million. Qatar, $1 to $5 million. Kuwait, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, millions upon millions flowing from the treasuries of the Middle East into the coffers of the Clinton Foundation. He stabbed his finger at each entry, physically emphasizing the source of the cash. He forced the audience to confront the hypocrisy. He reminded them that these were countries with abysmal human rights records, regimes where women were second-class citizens, where political dissent was punished with the lash, where public beheadings were a reality. He pointed out the cognitive dissonance of a woman who campaigned as a champion of women's rights and human rights accepting tens of millions of dollars from governments that systematically violated both. He noted specifically that Saudi Arabia executes people in public squares, yet their check cleared just fine. Bongino then moved to the quid pro quo, the transactional nature of these gifts. He pulled out meeting schedules and arms deal approvals, laying them side by side to show the undeniable correlation. He walked the audience through the timeline of a specific transaction in 2011. He showed the donation from Saudi Arabia arriving in March. He showed the meeting with Secretary Clinton scheduled for April. And then, he showed the result. A massive arms deal approved in May. $29 billion in advanced American weaponry sold to the kingdom. He piled document after document onto the desk, building a physical wall of evidence between them. He showed Qatar donating and receiving special consideration for hosting the World Cup. Despite credible, horrific allegations of slave labor used to build their stadiums, he showed Kuwait donating and seeing their requests for military hardware fast-tracked. He declared that the pattern was as clear as day, visible to anyone willing to open their eyes. The formula was simple: donate to the foundation, get access to the secretary, get what you want from the United States government. His voice dripped with disgust as he categorized the operation. He refused to call it charity. He called it money laundering through a philanthropic front. He called it pay to play. He called it corruption on a global scale. The selling of American foreign policy to the highest bidder, with the proceeds funneled into a tax-exempt slush fund. Hillary was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The carefully crafted image of the elder stateswoman was disintegrating under the barrage of specific dates and dollar amounts. She looked small, trapped in the glare of the studio lights, stripped of the protective layer of media deference she had enjoyed for decades. But Bongino had one final piece of financial evidence to present, the coup de grace of his economic argument. He reached into the binder and pulled out a graph. It was a simple line chart, stark and devastating in its visual clarity. He held it up for the cameras, urging the viewers at home to look closely. It tracked Clinton Foundation donations over time. He traced the line with his finger. He showed the spike, the explosive growth in revenue that coincided exactly with her confirmation as Secretary of State. He described foreign governments falling over themselves to donate, suddenly overcome with a charitable spirit the moment she gained control over the State Department. The line soared, a monument to her accumulation of power. And then, he moved his finger to the right side of the graph. He pointed to the year 2016, specifically the month of November. He showed the precipitous drop, the way the line crashed towards zero the moment she lost the election. He let the visual sink in. The money dried up. The foreign governments stopped calling. The charitable impulse of the world's dictatorship vanished overnight. He asked the question that hung in the silence of the room. If this was really about charity, if it was really about helping the poor and the sick, why did the donations stop the second she lost her political power? Why did the Saudis and the Qataris suddenly stop caring about her good work when she could no longer approve their weapons sales? He didn't wait for an answer because the graph provided it. He stated the conclusion with a cold, hard finality. They weren't donating out of the goodness of their hearts. They were buying access. They were buying influence. They were buying favors from the future President of the United States. And when she had nothing left to sell, they stopped buying. The foundation was not a charity, it was a toll booth on the road to American power. And the toll booth was closed. Bongino sat back, allowing the devastating logic of the graph to settle over the audience. He had dismantled her financial integrity, exposed the hypocrisy of her alliances, and revealed the transactional nature of her public service. But he wasn't done. The financial corruption was merely the mechanism of greed. What came next was the cost of that ambition in human blood. He shifted his posture, the aggression of the prosecutor fading into something more somber, more personal. He looked at her not as a rival, but as a man looking at a dereliction of duty that defied comprehension. He brought up his time in the Secret Service again. But this time, the tone was different. It wasn't a boast about clearance levels, it was a testament to the ethos of the protector. He spoke of the lessons learned in the line of fire. Lesson number 1. You protect the principle. Lesson number 2. You never, ever abandon people in the field. He reached into the binder one more time. But he didn't pull out a spreadsheet or a subpoena. He pulled out photographs, 4 faces, captured in life, smiling, unaware of the fate that awaited them. He placed them on the desk with a reverence that silenced the room completely. He named them slowly, giving each man the dignity of his identity. Ambassador Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Tyrone Woods, Glenn Doherty. The names hung in the air, heavy with the ghosts of Benghazi. He recited the date, September 11, 2012. He described the outcome, 4 Americans dead. He described the duration, 13 hours of hell, 13 hours of fighting, of bleeding, of calling for help that never came. Bongino's voice began to shake, not with the theatrical anger of a pundit, but with the raw, suppressed fury of a man who had worn a badge and a gun. Who understood the sacred covenant between a government and the men it sends into harm's way? He looked at the woman who had sat in the safety of Washington while her people burned in Libya. He prepared to pivot from the corruption of her wallet to the corruption of her soul. The money was ugly, but Benghazi was unforgivable, and he had the cables, the emails, and the timelines to prove that the blood on her hands was not a result of the fog of war, but of cold, political calculation. The studio felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the conversation moved from high crimes to something far darker. The studio had fallen into a silence that felt almost religious, a stillness commanded by the presence of the four faces staring up from the desk. Bongino let the weight of their sacrifice settle before he began the autopsy of the betrayal. He focused first on Ambassador Chris Stevens, a man who had believed in the mission of diplomacy, a man who had trusted his government to watch over him in a war zone. Bongino's voice trembled with a controlled frequency, vibrating with the fury of a protector who recognizes a failure of the most basic duty. He stated that Stevens had known the ground truth. He had felt the temperature rising in Benghazi, had seen the security situation deteriorating day by day, and he had done exactly what a responsible leader does. He asked for help. Bongino reached into the binder and produced the cables. These were not interpretations or summaries, they were the desperate, bureaucratic cries for help sent from the front lines. He held them up one by one, a paper trail of negligence. He cited the request from March. Denied. He cited the request from April. Denied. He moved through the calendar of 2012, June, August. Each request met with the same cold refusal from Washington. Each word he spoke landed like a hammer blow against the silence. He read the State Department's official responses, the bloodless language of bureaucracy citing unavailable resources and budgetary constraints. He raised his voice, letting the anger spill over. He contrasted the claim of poverty with the reality of the department's spending. He pointed out that while the State Department claimed it had no money to protect Chris Stevens, it had found ample resources to support regime change in Libya. They had found resources to arm rebels. They had found billions for other priorities. But for the security of their own ambassador in a known hot zone, the cupboard was bare. He shifted the narrative to the night of the attack, September 11, 2012. He laid out the timeline with military precision, stripping away the fog of war that she had used as cover for years. Attack begins at 9:40 p.m. local time. He described the terror of Ambassador Stevens and Sean Smith taking refuge in the safe room, the compound being overrun by hostile forces, the smoke filling the lungs of men who realized, in their final moments, that no one was coming. Bongino paused, his jaw tightening as he spoke of the men at the CIA annex nearby. Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty. He spoke their names with the reverence due to warriors. He described their reaction to the sound of gunfire. These were operators. Their instinct was to run toward the fight, to save their countrymen, but they were told to stand down. He let that order hang in the air. Stand down. Wait for local security. Wait for a permission slip that would never come. He had to stop for a second to master his own emotion, the professional veneer cracking to reveal the human being beneath. He described how they disobeyed that order. They went anyway because that is what operators do. They do not abandon people in the field. He described the 13-hour firefight, the desperate defense on the rooftop, the laser sights cutting through the darkness, the mortars falling, and the agonizing wait for the sound of American air power that never arrived. He looked directly at Hillary, his eyes burning. 13 hours. They fought for 13 hours while she and her staff monitored the situation from Washington, debating the political optics rather than scrambling the jets. He accused her of paralysis, of weighing the election cycle against the lives of men bleeding out on a rooftop in North Africa. Hillary's face was ashen. This was not a policy debate about email servers. This was an accusation of moral cowardice. But Bongino was not finished. The failure to send help was only the first sin, the cover-up was the second. And it was even more damning because it required malice. not just incompetence. He stated that what happened next showed the world who she truly was. He accused her of lying to the families of the fallen. He pulled out the testimony from the parents and siblings who had stood on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base, waiting for the flag-draped coffins of their loved ones. He read the words of Charles Woods, the father of Tyrone Woods. He recounted the father's memory of the Secretary of State standing next to his son's casket, looking him in the eye, and telling him that the attack was the result of an internet video, a spontaneous protest gone wrong. He moved to Patricia Smith, the mother of Sean Smith. He described her testimony, how the secretary had promised her, face to face, that they would get the filmmaker responsible for the video. He cited Kate Quigley, the sister of Glenn Doherty, who recalled the same narrative being pushed on her in her moment of deepest grief. Bongino's voice shook with a barely suppressed rage. He accused her of looking grieving mothers and fathers in the eye and feeding them a fabrication because the truth, that it was a planned terrorist attack on the anniversary of 9/11, was politically inconvenient for an administration running on the slogan that Al-Qaeda was on the run. He knew she would deny it, she always did. But he had the proof. He held up a printed email, a document that shattered her defense entirely. It was an email sent to her daughter, Chelsea, under the pseudonym purely meant for family. The timestamp was 10:11 p.m. on the night of the attack, 2 hours after the assault began. He read the text slowly, ensuring every syllable was absorbed by the camera. The email stated explicitly that 2 officers had been killed by an Al-Qaeda-like group. He let the contradiction scream in the quiet studio. At 10 p.m. on the night of the attack, she told her daughter it was terrorism. The next day, she told the Egyptian Prime Minister it was a planned attack. But when she stood in front of the American people, and worse, when she stood in front of the families of the dead, she blamed a YouTube video. He shouted the accusation now, unable to contain the fury. She knew the truth the entire time. She knew it wasn't a protest. She knew it wasn't a movie review gone wrong. She lied to the public to protect an election narrative. And she used the grief of Gold Star families as a shield. The studio was completely silent except for the echo of his voice. The cruelty of the deception was laid bare. He described the scene of her testifying before Congress later, when the pressure finally mounted and she was forced to answer for the lies. He didn't need to look at the binder for this quote. Every person in the room knew it by heart. He recited her infamous outburst. What difference at this point does it make? He let the silence stretch out, letting the callousness of those words reverberate off the walls. Then, very quietly, he answered her. He told her exactly what difference it made. His voice dropped to a deadly calm, far more frightening than his shouting. He stated that it made a difference to Patricia Smith, who still sat in her home wondering why her son had to die. It made a difference to Charles Woods, who had to live with the knowledge that the Secretary of State had lied to his face over his son's body. It made a difference to Kate Quigley. He stood up then, unable to remain seated under the weight of the moral disparity. He declared that it made a difference to the next ambassador who gets sent to a dangerous posting. Who needs to know if his Secretary of State will move heaven and earth to save him or if she will check the polling data first? It made a difference to every Foreign Service officer, every Marine Guard, every special operator who puts their life on the line and needs to trust that their government has their back. His voice rose again, filling the space with the collective frustration of the betrayed. He shouted that it made a difference to the American people, who deserve leaders who tell the truth, who take responsibility, who value American blood more than political convenience. That, he declared, is what difference it makes. Anderson Cooper, pale and visibly shaken by the raw emotion unfolding on his set, tried to regain control, murmuring something about a commercial break. But Bongino ignored him completely. He was not done. He had dismantled her record, her foundation, and her failure in Benghazi. But there was one final pillar of her legacy that needed to be pulled down. He turned his gaze back to Hillary, who sat frozen, her defenses breached. He recalled her opening insult, her characterization of him as a conspiracy theorist. He accepted the label with a dark irony and pivoted to the offensive. He announced that if they were going to talk about conspiracy theories, they should discuss the biggest one in modern American history. The one she didn't just believe in, the one she paid for. He flipped the binder to a new section, the tabs marked with names that had dominated the news cycle for 4 years. He announced the next subject, the Steele dossier, the Russia hoax, the greatest fraud ever perpetrated on the American electorate. Hillary's eyes went wide. She had expected him to stop at Benghazi. She hadn't realized he intended to salt the earth of her entire political operation. Bongino pulled out the payment records, the paper trail of the dirty trick. He traced the flow of money with the tip of his finger. From her campaign to the law firm Perkins Coie. From Perkins Coie to the opposition research firm Fusion GPS. From Fusion GPS to Christopher Steele, a foreign spy. And from Steele to his sources, actual Russian intelligence operatives. He laid it out clearly. She had paid for Russian disinformation. She had financed a foreign spy to work with the Kremlin's agents to compile a dossier of salacious, unverified, and ultimately false allegations against her political opponent. And then, in a stroke of Machiavellian brilliance, she had fed that fake intelligence to the FBI, to the media, and to the Department of Justice, using it to trigger a special counsel investigation that would tear the country apart. He pulled out the internal FBI documents, the memos that proved the Bureau knew it was a sham from the beginning. He read the agent's own assessments, uncorroborated, unreliable, impossible to verify. He jabbed his finger at her, accusing her of knowing it was garbage but using it anyway. She had weaponized the intelligence apparatus of the United States against a private citizen because she couldn't accept that she was losing. Hillary tried to speak, tried to invoke the Mueller investigation, but her voice was weak, drowned out by the avalanche of facts. Bongino rolled over her objections. He reminded the room that the Mueller investigation, after 2 years and $40 million, found nothing, no collusion, no conspiracy. It was a hoax she created, a hoax she funded, and a hoax she used to poison the American well. He leaned over the desk, invading her space with the truth. He accused her of damaging democracy far more than any riot or protest ever could. She had made half the country believe their president was a traitor, and the other half believed their government was a lie. And she did it all because she couldn't handle the reality of rejection. Anderson Cooper was practically begging for a cut to commercial now, the situation having spiraled completely out of his control. Hillary stood up abruptly, the screech of her chair legs against the floor sounding like a surrender. She declared that she did not have to sit there and be subjected to character assassination. Bongino laughed, a harsh, unforgiving sound. He retorted that he wasn't assassinating her character, he was reading her resume. He was reading the FBI files, the federal documents, the tax returns. These were facts. And as she prepared to flee the stage, he prepared to deliver the final indictment, the one that went beyond politics and struck at the heart of the class divide she represented. Hillary stood by her chair, her hand hovering near the microphone she had already unclipped, a gesture of imminent departure. She was done with the interrogation, done with the ambush, but Bongino was not done with the indictment. He lowered his voice, shifting from the thunder of the prosecutor to the quiet, simmering intensity of the street cop. He brought up the label she had famously applied to half the country. The deplorables. The word hung in the air, toxic and heavy. He reminded her of the other adjectives she had attached to that basket: racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, and finally, the most damning of all, irredeemable. He shook his head, looking at her with a mixture of pity and disdain. He told her what he saw when he looked at those people. He didn't see a basket of bigots. He saw his family. He saw the neighborhood in Queens where he grew up. The apartment above the candy store where the floorboards creaked and the rent was always due. He saw firefighters who ran into burning buildings while the elite ran out. He saw nurses, construction workers, cops on the beat, people who showered after work, not before, people who loved their country, who followed the rules, who paid their taxes so people like her could draw a salary. He accused her of despising them not because of their character, but because of their independence. She called them deplorable because they refused to bow to her, because they didn't offer her their votes as a tribute, because they saw through the polished veneer of her public persona. She was gathering her papers now, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, the mask of the unflappable stateswoman completely shattered. Bongino pressed the point, widening the lens from the specific scandal to the fundamental divide in American life. He declared that this confrontation wasn't about Democrat versus Republican. It was about the ruling class versus the working class. It was about people like her versus people like him. He pointed a finger at her, then turned it back to his own chest. He contrasted their origins with a brutal efficiency. Park Ridge, Illinois, Wellesley College, Yale Law School, the Rose Garden, the Governor's Mansion, the White House, a life paved with gold and influence. Then he described his own path. Queens, the NYPD, the Secret Service, a life built on the pavement, earning every step, fighting for every inch. He stepped out from behind the desk, closing the physical distance between them, invading the sterile bubble of the television set with the raw energy of the real world. He defined the essential difference between their souls. He had spent his career protecting people, placing his body between the innocent and the bullet. She had spent hers using people, climbing over them, exploiting them, enriching herself while their towns died and their factories closed. Hillary snapped. The composure that had been her trademark for 40 years finally evaporated. She refused to listen to any more. She lashed out, her voice trembling with a rage that bordered on hysteria. She called the proceedings a lynching, a high-tech lynching. The studio went dead silent. The air left the room. Even her most ardent supporters in the audience shifted uncomfortably, the historical weight of that word landing with a sickening thud. To compare a televised reading of public records to the horrific history of racial violence was a bridge too far. Even for her. Bongino stared at her, his expression hardening into stone. When he spoke, the anger was gone, replaced by a profound, disappointed sadness. He schooled her on the definition. A lynching is what happened to Black Americans who had done nothing wrong but exist in a society that hated them. It was violence visited upon the innocent. What was happening in this studio was a law enforcement official reading from her public record and asking her to account for her actions. He gestured broadly to the binder, to the piles of evidence that now littered the desk like the debris of a storm. These were facts, numbers, dates, her own words, her own emails, her foundation's tax returns, FBI case files, congressional testimony, all of it public, all of it verifiable, all of it true. He delivered the verdict to her face. She was not being lynched. She was being held accountable. And the reason she couldn't stand it, the reason she was fleeing the stage, was because people like her had never been held accountable for anything in their entire lives. Hillary grabbed her purse and marched toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the studio floor. Anderson Cooper, desperate to maintain some semblance of broadcast norms, called out to her, asking if she wanted to make a final statement. She turned at the door, her face flushed with the humiliation of the moment. She attempted to reclaim the high ground, claiming she had come to discuss issues, only to be subjected to a partisan attack filled with debunked conspiracy theories. She declared that the American people were smarter than this, that they knew the truth. Bongino's voice rang out across the studio, stopping her hand on the door handle. He asked the simple, devastating question. If she had the truth, why was she leaving? If she had answers for the emails, for the foundation, for Benghazi, for the Russia hoax, she should stay and give them. She didn't answer. She shook her head, pushed the door open, and vanished into the corridor. The heavy sound of the studio door swinging shut signaled the end of an era. The audience sat in stunned silence. The carefully choreographed event had collapsed into chaos. Half the room looked shell-shocked, mourning the destruction of their idol. The other half looked vindicated, as if a pressure valve had finally been released. Anderson Cooper, ever the professional, called for a commercial break, his voice strained and thin. As the red lights on the cameras dimmed, the studio erupted. Producers shouted into headsets, camera operators checked their feeds, and the social media teams frantically began to clip the footage. The control room was a scene of panic, but Bongino sat back down in his chair. He took a sip of water. He waited. He wasn't going anywhere. 3 minutes later, they were back live. The empty chair opposite Bongino spoke louder than any presence could. Cooper acknowledged the departure of the secretary and offered Bongino the floor for a closing statement. Bongino looked past Cooper, past the studio audience, and stared directly into the camera lens. He spoke to the millions watching at home, to the mechanics in Ohio, the waitresses in Florida, the cops in New York. He stated that this wasn't about him versus Hillary Clinton. It was about the integrity of the system itself. It was about whether America had one system of justice for the powerful and another for everyone else. He leaned forward, his intensity burning through the screen. He spoke of the people he had arrested, men and women in handcuffs for doing far less than what the former Secretary of State had done with her classified emails. He spoke of the lives he had seen destroyed for a single mistake with a single document. He spoke of the soldiers and sailors sitting in prison cells at that very moment for compromising security, while the political elite gave speeches and collected checks. He declared that the American people deserved better than a two-tiered justice system. They deserved leaders who served the public, not themselves. Leaders who told the truth even when it was painful. Leaders who took responsibility instead of making excuses. He pointed to the empty chair. He noted that Secretary Clinton had every opportunity to explain herself, to refute the evidence, to clear her name. Instead, she attacked the messenger, claimed victimhood, and walked out. That, he concluded, told the audience everything they needed to know. When you can't argue the facts, you attack the person. When you can't defend the record, you flee the debate. His voice softened as he thought of the 4 men in the photographs. He stated that the families of the fallen in Benghazi deserved better. The victims of the Russia hoax deserved the truth. This was about equal justice under the law. Until the powerful faced the same consequences as the powerless, there was no justice at all. Anderson Cooper ended the broadcast with a somber nod, as the lights went down and the crew began to break down the set. Bongino sat alone for a moment. He thought about the timeline, the lies, the sheer weight of the corruption he had just laid bare. His phone was vibrating incessantly, messages from colleagues, requests from networks, the digital roar of a world reacting to what it had just witnessed. He ignored it all. He packed up the binder, closing the cover on the evidence. A CNN staffer approached him on the way out, eyes wide, whispering that the clip was already viral, that it was the most intense thing they had ever seen. Bongino just nodded. He didn't care about the clicks. He cared about the record. He walked out into the cool New York night, the air tasting sweet after the recycled atmosphere of the studio. His security detail fell in around him, because even the hunters need protection in these times, and they moved toward the waiting car. He knew the fallout would be immense. The machine would strike back. The media would spin. The pundits would scream. And the establishment would try to bury him. But as the sun rose the next morning, the narrative had already escaped their control. The headline, "Bongino destroys Clinton," was everywhere. The footage was unassailable. The evidence was too specific, too grounded in official documentation to be dismissed as partisan noise. Political analysts, forced to be honest for once, called it a catastrophic collapse for Hillary. Her comeback was dead on arrival. The Democratic Party leadership, privately relieved to be rid of the albatross, began to distance themselves, talking about the future and the need to move on from the baggage of the past. Hillary Clinton retreated into silence, her defenders offering only half-hearted tweets that were swallowed by the tide of evidence. But the real impact wasn't in the corridors of Washington. It was in the firehouses of Queens, the precinct breakrooms in Chicago, the VFW halls in Texas. In those places, people felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, vindication. They felt that someone had finally stood up for them. Someone had finally walked into the lion's den and refused to be eaten. Someone had proven that the rules still mattered, that fact still mattered, and that a guy from above a candy store could stare down the most powerful political machine in history and win. Simply by telling the truth. Bongino returned to his office at the FBI, declining the victory lap the media wanted him to take. He had a job to do. But he knew, as he sat down at his desk and opened the next file, that the fight was never really over. There would always be another corrupt official, another lie to uncover, another battle for the soul of the justice system. But for one night, on a stage in New York, the street fighter had landed the knockout blow. And justice, for once, had won the round.